All right, evening everybody. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Yuval Levin. I'm Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies here. And it's a very great pleasure for me to welcome Richard Brookhiser to discuss his wonderful new book, Give Me Liberty. Rick is a historian, he's a journalist, a scholar, a writer. He's a senior editor at National Review, and over several decades now, he's written an extraordinary series of biographies of great American figures, especially statesmen of the founding generation. His new book, Give Me Liberty, is in a sense an extension of that work, but rather than a biography of a great American statesman, it's a biography of a great American idea, maybe the defining idea of America's national character. It's a history of liberty in the American political tradition, told through a series of core documents of that tradition, from the minutes of the Jamestown General Assembly to Ronald Reagan's case against communism. These speeches and letters and statements and declarations offer a kind of narrative of the American ideal of liberty. And in each case, Rick provides the story behind the words, a context and background that lets us understand these essential original documents in their own terms. It's a brilliant concept, it's wonderfully well executed, and it gives us a lot to talk about tonight, about American history and the American story. The format's going to be very simple. Rick will come up here and speak a little bit about his book, then he and I will have a short conversation about the book and chat a little bit about some of the core ideas, and then we'll open it up to you and your questions about it. So with that, please join me in welcoming Richard Brookhiser.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Yuval. Why stand we here idle? What do gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course other men may take, but as for me, give me liberty, give me death. Patrick Henry, March 1775, addressing the former House of Burgesses. It had been dismissed by the Royal Governor of Virginia, but it continued to meet illegally as the Virginia Convention. And in March 1775, they were discussing unrest in the sister colony of Massachusetts, which would soon break out into open warfare. Americans were talking about liberty, they were getting ready to fight for it, and they would soon be dying for it. But this wasn't a unique moment. And it was far from the first moment. Americans had been doing this already for over 150 years, and they would continue to do it for more than 200. We've been yearning for it, we have been establishing it, and we have been defending it for 400 years. It is our exceptional idea. It's the characteristic of our nationalism. As Yuval explained, my book is 13 episodes. Each one produced a document. Just go over what they are. The first one was the minutes of the first General Assembly at Jamestown, 1619. Number 2 is the Flushing Remonstrance, 1657. Number 3 is the record of the trial of John Peter Zenger, 1735. 4, Declaration of Independence, 1776. 5, the Constitution of the New York Manumission Society, 1785. 6, the Constitution, 1787, ratified the following year. 7, Monroe Doctrine, 1823. 8, the Declaration of Sentiments of the Seneca Falls Convention, 1848. 9, the Gettysburg Address, 1863. 10, the New Colossus, written in 1883 and affixed to the basis of the Statue of Liberty, which was dedicated in 1886. 11, the Cross of Gold speech, 1896. 12, the Arsenal of Democracy fireside chat by Franklin Roosevelt, 1940. And 13, the Tear Down This Wall speech, Ronald Reagan, 1987. Some of these documents are long. Some of them are quite short. Some of them are by or signed by famous men. Men and women, 3 of them are on Mount Rushmore. Some of them are by ordinary people. A few of them you've all read many times. At least one of them I bet no one here has read. But they're all vital to this American engagement with the idea of liberty. So what I want to do tonight is just talk about 2 of them, maybe 3, depending on how much time we have. And the first one I want to do is number 2, the Flushing Remonstrance. Many of these documents establish principles, establish them for the first time, or describe them resonantly. And the Flushing Remonstrance is one of these. And the principle it sets forth is religious liberty. And this did not take place in the United States or in British North America. It was written in New Netherland when it was a Dutch colony. The Dutch had settled Fort Orange, which is now Albany, in 1622. They bought Manhattan in 1624. They went as far south as the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia, as far north as the Battenkill in Vermont. Any stream in the Northeast that has kill in the name was where the Dutch at first settled. In the 1640s, the Dutch West India Company, which owned the colony, sent a new director general to the New World. He was named Peter Stuyvesant. And where I live in Manhattan, I look out my window to Stuyvesant Park, which is on land that he once owned. And there's a statue of him in the park. It's one of the best public sculptures in New York. It's bronze. He's life-size. He's got his hand on a tall walking stick. He has a peg leg because he lost a leg battling the Spaniards in the Caribbean for Holland. And Peter Stuyvesant looks very sharp. He looks very determined. And he looks as if you would not want to cross him. He was very efficient, effective, and a little crazy. It's not unlike Giuliani. And his craziness was that he was a tyrant and a bigot. Everything had to be his way, particularly everything religious. His father was a minister of the Dutch Reformed Church, and he believed that Calvinist Christianity was the only acceptable route to heaven. So, as Director General of New Netherland, he presides over a polyglot population. It's a port city. There are Dutch, French, Germans, English. And he harasses the Lutherans and Jews who live there. But there are Lutheran and Jewish directors and investors of the Dutch West India Company, which employs him. So he's told to back off, and as a good company man, he backs off those faiths. Then a third religion appears in his domain. These are Quakers. This is a new religion. It sprung up in England during the English Civil War, and it is countercultural. Quakers do not use different forms of address for different social ranks because they don't recognize any difference in social ranks. They will not doff their hats. They let women exhort equally with men in their meetings. The first party of Quakers to show up in New Netherland is a ship captained by an English Quaker named Robert Fowler. Fowler has a meeting with Stuyvesant, and Stuyvesant tells him to keep sailing. So he goes up Long Island Sound to Rhode Island. Fowler leaves behind 2 women, Dorothy Waugh and Mary Weatherhead. And they begin preaching in the streets that the world is about to end. You must heed our exhortations. So Stuyvesant has these women arrested and escorted out of the colony. Then a 4th Quaker appears, a man named Richard Hodgson. And he starts preaching in western Long Island, which is part of Stuyvesant's domain. Stuyvesant arrests him, and probably because he's a man, not a woman, he whips him. He whips him in public, and he whips him in private. He whips him so hard he gets an anonymous letter from one of his subjects begging him to lay off because he's afraid he will simply be whipped to death. So then Stuyvesant expels Hodgson. And then he declares a new policy. No more Quakers may arrive. Any ship that carries them will be fined. Anyone who harbors them in his house will be penalized. And then in 1657, Stuyvesant gets a letter from 30 men in the village of Flushing. This is in western Long Island. It's still there. It's part of the borough of Queens, but then it was an independent village. And these 30 men send Stuyvesant a remonstrance, which is a public protest. It's written by a man named Edward Hart, who is the town clerk. It's also signed by the 2 town magistrates and by a 4th official who's the equivalent of the district attorney. And then 26 other men signed this. 6 of them couldn't spell their own names. They could only make their marks. But they laid down an important marker. They said to Stuyvesant that we could not obey his directive because we would do unto others as we would have all men do unto us. This is the true law of church and state. For our Savior saith, this is the law and the prophets. So they are not saying this because we're Quakers and we don't want to be punished. They're saying, we don't want you to punish these Quakers because that is not the law and the prophets. They also haven't read John Locke, because this is decades before John Locke wrote about religious toleration. They are basing this idea on their reading of Scripture, and they're sending this in a remonstrance to Peter Stuyvesant. Well, what Stuyvesant does is he cracks down. He begins arresting people. One of the first is Edward Hart, the town clerk, who wrote the remonstrance. And because the Dutch kept very good records, we have the record of Stuyvesant's interrogation of Hart. And he asks Hart, did all the men who signed this paper agree with what's written in it? Hart says, I don't know. I was just capturing the general sense of a meeting. Where was the meeting held? It was held in Michael Miller's house. Who called the meeting? I don't know. Did the other officials who signed this agree with what you wrote? I read it to them beforehand, but I don't know what they thought about it. It goes on and on. You can tell Hart is trying to dodge away from these questions, not to try and implicate his fellow residents of Flushing. But Stuyvesant is relentless. He throws Hart in prison for a month. He arrests the other 3 officials. And then sadly, they all crack. I mean, we would want people who said a brave, true thing to be firm to the end, but we're not alone with Peter Stuyvesant when the only people who can rein him in are across the Atlantic Ocean. So the signers of the Flushing Remonstrance do give in. But that's not the end of the story, because yet another Quaker comes into Stuyvesant's domain, a man named John Bone. And this man, Stuyvesant throws in jail for 5 months. He's probably hoping that he will crack too. And when he doesn't, he decides to send him to Holland to be tried. And the Dutch West India Company tries him and writes Stuyvesant a letter saying, we don't like Quakers any better than you do, but we want settlers in our colony, so leave them alone also, which Stuyvesant is finally forced to do. This is 1663. A year later, the English show up in what is now New York Harbor with an armada, and they demand Stuyvesant's capitulation, which he does. But one of the terms of the capitulation is that the residents of the colony, now to be named New York, will continue to enjoy the religious liberties that they already have. Now, the Flushing Remonstrance is relatively obscure because I think not only did England conquer the colony, but English America conquered the historical record. You know, our colonial record is Massachusetts and Virginia, essentially. And we pay a little attention to Philadelphia because that's where the Declaration of Independence was signed. But the Dutch experience has faded from our collective memory. But it left its imprint on New York, which is important because by 1800, New York is the largest city in this country, which it continues to be today. For over 150 years, New York State was the largest state. And the religious behavior and composition of New York laid its impress on the entire country. A second document I want to talk about is in a category of documents that plug gaps, because we haven't always been true to this principle. We have violated it. The worst violation, obviously, was chattel slavery, which took 750,000 men dying to finally rectify. The traditional figure for Civil War deaths for the longest time was 620,000. That's adding up the official death tolls from the Union and the Confederacy. But I met the historian who recently raised it, and he did it, he's a demographic historian, and he did it by looking at census records and concluding, we're missing 130,000 men. So it was actually 750,000 who were killed. But another gap, it didn't require bloodshed to be undone, but almost equally striking, was the fact that for the longest time, hardly any women voted in colonial America or the independent United States. Women did vote in New Jersey from 1776 to 1807. If they passed the property qualification, they could vote in the state of New Jersey. Now, it probably started as an oversight because New Jersey's first post-independence constitution was rushed together in the midst of a British invasion in the summer of 1776. And instead of using the word freeman, they used the word inhabitant. But women noticed this, and they began presenting themselves at the polls. And then in a few years, election laws used language like voters shall put his or her ballots in such and such a box in such and such a place. Now, the trick here was that you had to pass a property qualification, and in marriage, all property belonged to the husband in those days. It was a legal doctrine called coverture. But if you were a single woman or a widow who had enough property, you could vote in New Jersey. And there were enough of them that they had a name. They were called the petticoat vote. And politicians had to be mindful of them and tried to win their vote. Now, they lose it in 1807 because there is a spectacularly corrupt election, even by New Jersey standards. And in a spasm of regret, New Jersey decides to purge itself by removing the vote from free blacks and from women. So they became the scapegoats for this corrupt vote. And then there were no voting women in the United States. But this changes. It begins to change because of a woman from upstate New York, born in Johnstown, New York in 1815, Elizabeth Cady. Her father was a judge who had served a term in Congress. Cady and his wife had 10 children. 5 of them died, including all their boys. Elizabeth got a good education. She was very smart. She acted as her father's de facto law clerk. And he would often sigh to her, "It's a shame you weren't born a boy." And she must have resented this even as she appreciated this. And she certainly resented the fact that there were opportunities open to boys and to men that were barred to her. She marries a man named Henry Stanton, who is active in the abolition movement. Stanton is an abolitionist orator, and he's also participating in small abolitionist political parties, which are formed in the 1840s. There's a Liberty Party early in the decade, and then there's a Free Soil Party towards the end of it, and Stanton is active in both. In 1840, he and his wife go to a worldwide anti-slavery convention in London. And there, an issue comes up at the convention: shall the women in attendance be allowed to vote on our resolutions? And this provokes a debate, a heated debate, and the result of it is that women are forbidden the vote in London. And there, or shortly thereafter, Elizabeth Cady Stanton tells a friend of hers, "Couldn't we have a convention on women's rights?" She holds on to this thought for a number of years. She and her husband moved to a town called Seneca Falls, which is in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. And in the summer of 1848, she's having tea with several of her friends. She's at the house of Jane Hunt, who's married to a factory owner, Richard Hunt. The tea is Hunt, Stanton, few of their friends, plus Mr. Hunt. And years later, she remembered that the women were all talking about the hardness of their life. And she said, one of the things she said was the complete chaos into which everything falls without women's constant supervision. Now, at this point, she has 3 children, 3 boys, 6, 4, and 3. She may have miscarried that spring. There's some coded language and letters that indicate it. We're not entirely sure. But she's obviously feeling the weight of the world, and her husband is never around because he's out politicking. And 1848 is a presidential election year, so he's never home. So she and her friends are talking about this. And Richard Hunt says, why don't you do something about it? So they decide to hold a women's rights convention. They have to do it quickly because they're counting on a woman abolitionist orator, Lucretia Mott, who's visiting relatives in the neighborhood, but she's going to go back to her home in Philadelphia very soon. So they have to hold this within the next month. They have a second meeting where they try to draw up a declaration of sentiments that the entire convention will endorse. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton described them trying to figure out how do we begin this. And then someone picked up the Declaration of Independence, began reading the first 2 paragraphs. And they thought, this is how we'll do it. And the opening of the Declaration of Sentiments very carefully tracks the language of the Declaration of Independence. Of course, there's a shrewd political reason for doing this, because the oppressors that they're fighting, unlike Jefferson and the Americans were revolting against the king and parliament. And if they won, they would be gone. They'd be an ocean away. But Stanton and her friends are complaining about the oppression of men who are not going to go anywhere. But by echoing the Declaration of Independence, they're appealing to men as Americans. They're saying, you already agree with us. You already believe this. We're echoing the language of something that you all also believe. Now, the Bill of Particulars can't imitate the Declaration. That's all new. They complain about the fact that there's no college education for women. At that time, there was only one college that admitted women, Oberlin. There were certainly no professorships open to women. Women were not allowed to be ministers in churches, except in the Quaker faith, which had no clergy at all, but any Quaker male or female was able to speak at a meeting. The Declaration also complains about social hypocrisy, that there are faults that women can commit that will ruin their reputations, but if men commit them, they get off scot-free, it's okay. It's anticipating the Me Too movement. And one of the complaints is that women are denied their inalienable right of suffrage. And this was something that Elizabeth Cady Stanton insisted on putting in the document. It was the only thing that got resistance. It got resistance because many of her women colleagues were Quakers. And Quakers, in those days, they would agitate for causes, but they would not participate in politics beyond that. They thought all politics was corrupt. So you couldn't run for office. You probably shouldn't even vote. Lucretia Mott tells Stanton before the convention, she says, Lizzie, thee will make the convention ridiculous. But she's the daughter of an ex-congressman. And her husband is a politician. She's lived with politics all her life. And she knows that if you don't have a say in it, there is no one in it who will stand up for your interests as well as you can. Therefore, we ought to have the vote. The convention is held over 2 days. The only matter of debate is whether women's vote should be in the Declaration of Sentiments. Stanton speaks in favor of it. Another speaker in favor is Frederick Douglass. He comes from Rochester, New York, which is where he has a newspaper already. He's famous as a ex-slave who's an abolitionist orator, but he also comes to the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls. He says that some people have discovered that the Negro has rights, but they have not yet discovered that women have any. So that's the argument that he makes. And the convention decides to call for women to have the right to vote. Now, what happens to this for the longest time is nothing, because abolition and the issues that it raises are the black hole which is sucking everything political into it and finally results in the Civil War, then the struggle over Reconstruction. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she makes an unfortunate statement after the Civil War. You know, why should, when the post-war amendments are being debated, she says, why should Sambo have the right to vote when women don't? And Frederick Douglass, in very dignified manner, says if women were being strung up simply for being women, it would be equally urgent to give them the vote now as it is to give it to black men. So women's right to vote is cast in the shade. The first place to grant it is the territory of Wyoming in 1869. A few more Western territories follow, then a few more Western states. New York State grants women the right to vote in 1917, and the constitutional amendment doesn't happen until 1920. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton has died early in the 20th century, but in New York State, there was one surviving signer of the Seneca Falls Declaration. There was a woman in Geneva, New York, named Rhoda Palmer. She'd come with her father to Seneca Falls when she was 32 years old. She remembered that we drove over in a gig, and on the way back, the gig broke down, and we had to spend an extra night on the road. But she's now in Geneva. She's only lived in Geneva all her life, only ever in 2 houses. She's 102, and in 1918, she is driven to the polls to vote. So that is an example of a gap being filled. Now, I could go on with one other thing, but Yuval, maybe we want to talk. What do you think? Okay, I'll just tease the other category of documents, which are those which have to do with foreign affairs. And it may seem paradoxical to discuss that in a book on American liberty, because, you know, why talk about the world when the subject is liberty in America? But the world has always been nearby. It was nearby when we were part of a colonial empire that bordered on rival colonial empires. The world has been nearby throughout all our history. And there have been moments when we decided that the fate of liberty elsewhere was of vital interest to us. The 3 I picked out were the Monroe Doctrine, the Arsenal of Democracy fireside chat, and the Tear Down This Wall speech. The Monroe Doctrine, 1823, there's a wave of revolutions throughout the world. Spanish America is in revolt against the mother country. There's been a liberal revolution in Spain, which has curtailed the power of the king, and Greece is in revolt against the Ottoman Empire. France has sent an army over the Pyrenees to restore absolutism in Spain, and there are true rumors that France would like to send princes of the House of Bourbon to be rulers of the new nations of Latin America. In other words, to bring them back under European influence and under royal government. And President Monroe's first idea is to condemn all this reactionary opposition across the board. He's persuaded by his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, to only draw the line at the Western Hemisphere. And the Monroe Doctrine ends up saying to Congress, this is what we'd call his State of the Union address. It was the message that the presidents then sent to Congress in December. Monroe says, we have sympathy with the struggles for liberty in Europe, although we won't take any part in the wars of Europe. But we have to tell Europe that any efforts to restore your political system here will be unacceptable. The way the Monroe Doctrine is usually taught is we don't want recolonization, and that was certainly part of it. But it also mentioned their political system. Monroe was saying no more kings in this hemisphere. There will be no more kings. And that's been a pretty accurate description of the development of this hemisphere. There have been a few dictators who set themselves up as monarchs, but they didn't last very long. The arsenal of democracy, of course, is the run-up to World War II. Roosevelt announces that freedom in Britain is vital to us, no Nazis in Britain. And the Tear Down This Wall speech, of course, is in what turned out to be the waning days of the Cold War. Reagan telling the world that we would not accept communism maintaining itself in Berlin, and calling on Gorbachev to come and tear down this wall, which Gorbachev never physically does, although he does announce at the beginning of 1989 that he won't interfere in liberation movements in Eastern Europe, and then that's the end of it. So we can talk about that or other things. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rick.
I'll make my way back to this 2000 Space Odyssey-like chair.
It's modern, right? Thanks very much, Rick. Appreciate that. It's a wonderful book. What moved you to write it now? You've written a series of biographies of the founders mostly, and of Lincoln. Surely you hadn't run out of founders. What drove you to this different approach to some of these questions?
Well, the short answer was it was my wife's idea. She suggested 3 books so far. Professor Akhil Amar at Yale Law School has suggested 2, so he's behind. He's got to catch up. Well, but it was, I think it's ignored. No one's talking about liberty, really. The right doesn't talk about it much anymore, and the left hasn't been. And this is both vital and it's inspiring, and I wanted to celebrate it. And that's the short but true answer. I thought of 12 episodes at first, 12 documents. Then I added a 13th. I won't say which one the 13th was. I guess I was thinking the 12 tables of the Roman law, and then I thought, well, wait, come on, 13 colonies. Let's do that. So we've got 13 in there. But as I said, some of them are, some of them are famous, some of them are obscure. There could be a B team. There could be another 13, or even a second and a third and a fourth. And I think that's one characteristic of a country which is as concerned with liberty as ours has been, that there can be other famous statements and manifestations of it, which shouldn't make us confident that they will always reappear. We always have to work to make them reappear. But anyway, that's why I decided to write this now.
So in going through these and in thinking about how liberty presents itself in these different ways in our history, were you left with a sense of the evolution of the idea? There's not one simple notion of liberty in these documents. Is there a pattern through these that somehow runs through history?
Well, there is certainly a widening of the focus. I mean, the lens is, encompassing more. The first one, the General Assembly of Jamestown, is self-rule, because this floundering colony in Virginia that had been there for 12 years and going through a series of disasters and experimenting with different ways to run itself. If you read early accounts of Jamestown, first-person accounts, they all have the same pattern. Everybody else screwed up except me. And it just sounds like it was a mess. But in 1619, there was a new mandate from the investment company that owned and ran Jamestown, and there was a meeting of a proto-parliament. It had the governor and his advisors, who were picked by London, but also burgesses elected by the local people. And over time, they began to take more and more power unto themselves, not just advisory or not just making recommendations, but actual laws. And inattention in London helped foster this. So that's self-rule. Flushing Remonstrance, religious liberty. Trial of John Peter Zenger is the liberty to criticize our rulers. He was this famous trial in colonial New York about seditious libel. He had criticized the royal governor of the colony, who threw him in jail, and he had this brilliant lawyer who basically got the jury to nullify the law, to free him, even though the law of seditious libel was the law on the books. But the effect of that was that hardly any seditious libel prosecutions were brought in colonial America after that, because you couldn't get a jury to convict. So the colonial American press was by far the freest and most freewheeling in the world. But those are specific rights. Then with the Declaration, you get a kind of binding together of all of them, and even more. I mean, how can you say something new about the Declaration? I'm not sure that I have, but one thing that struck me as kind of newish is, I think one of the most important words in it is among. Among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So it's like, that's not the whole list. There are others too, among. I'm just going to mention 3 important ones here, but there's more out there. And then the Gettysburg Address is Lincoln saying, yes, we really mean this. Jefferson was right. We really mean this. We also mean self-rule, because it's government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So he's got the Declaration at the beginning of this 272-word speech, and he's got the preamble of the Constitution at the end. It's like this marvelous fitting into rhetorical feat. So yes, and then there's also the geographic point I mentioned, that there is increasing interest in places in the world where it's under attack or under threat, where we have decided that it directly affects us. And I guess in telling these stories, I tried to emphasize that these were not just off-the-cuff pronouncements by Monroe or by FDR or by Reagan, that a lot of thought went into it before they said it. And Monroe wanted a broader thing, and then, second thoughts with his Secretary of State's advice, he shaped it a little bit. Roosevelt had been worried about the Nazi threat for years. He'd reshaped his administration to deal with this. He got in new personnel. George Marshall was telling him it's going to take 1.5 years before we could even consider participating in the Second World War. He's not rushing into anything blindly. And similarly, Reagan, I tell Richard Allen's great story that after Reagan loses to Ford in '76, and he's thinking of his next run, and Richard Allen, this foreign policy intellectual, wants to work for him. And Reagan says, well, my idea of the Cold War is very simple. Some might call it simple-minded. We win and they lose. What do you think of that? And it's like it's Reagan, so it's kind of a joke, but he has been thinking about this already for years and continues to think and plan. So when he gets to Berlin, it's not like he thought of doing this the day before. This was a point in a long arc.
I'm curious about the take you offer on religious liberty, a crucial American liberty, the first liberty in the First Amendment. The Flushing Remonstrance, I'm tempted to say it's very obscure because I'd never heard of it before this book. Maybe it's not that obscure.
Everybody has said that.
Okay.
I think only Jack Fowler at National Review had heard of it.
I knew about Flushing as home to the world's best kosher Chinese food, but other than that, I didn't know much of importance that happened in Flushing, Queens. Why that as a marker of religious liberty? It's a very distinct idea of liberty that's not really rooted in liberalism. It's religious liberty as a religious obligation.
Right. Well, I think, liberalism is important, and, to people of intellectual disposition, it's maybe, more important than to ordinary people. But if that's all we were relying on, it might be a weak read. I think it also helped enormously that there was this authentically religious strain in American religious thinking, and it's certainly not the only one. We've had plenty of bigots in this country, but also people saying, as the men of Flushing said, that we would do unto others as we want all men to do unto us, and our Savior saith, this is the law and the prophets. And they also, if you read the Remonstrance, that's hard reading. It's very dense, kind of 17th century prose. And they're making other arguments. They're saying, well, the laws of Holland are very tolerant, so we're appealing to those. We also have a town charter. We appeal to our rights in our charter, but they keep coming back to this concept which they're getting from their reading of the Bible. And I just thought it was so important to flag that.
You mentioned one sort of gap in the story of liberty in talking about women's rights. The other gap, the great gap, of course, is around the question of slavery, literally the opposite of liberty.
Right.
An institution very deeply rooted in the American story. How does the fact that this is a liberty-loving country work with the fact that this was the home of that kind of chattel slavery? And what was the role of liberty as an idea in the struggle against slavery?
Well, there was a paradoxical role in this respect. Our ending of slavery is 1865. So that is after every colonial European power has forbidden it in their empires. It's after serfs are freed in Russia. I mean, really only Brazil. Brazil doesn't free its slaves till the 1880s. It's an independent country by then. And of course, slavery persists in Africa and the Arab world. But those liberations were either imperial decisions, from the center to the colonies. All right, you guys out there in the Caribbean, you can't do this anymore. Or the czar is an autocrat. And there happened to be a liberal czar, or a czar who was classically liberal on this point. And, he has an organization and a deep state, and all the rest of it that he has to overcome. But he does, because he's the czar of all the Russias. Okay, all right, we'll free the serfs. The difficulties in the United States are that you can't do that. Now, of course, Lincoln is able to do that to a great extent during the Civil War using his war powers in time of rebellion. But that's why the Emancipation Proclamation is so carefully parsed. And it's limited. It doesn't touch slavery in the forced slave states that remained in the Union. It doesn't touch slavery in the parts of the Confederacy that we had already liberated from their rebel governments. Andrew Johnson, the vice president, gets an exemption for the whole state of Tennessee. Lincoln's a lawyer, and he's doing this. He's finding, what power do I have to do this? Well, I could only do this as commander-in-chief in time of rebellion. And then this is also why the 13th Amendment is vitally important, because after the war ends, that power will be gone. And so Congress has to and does, pass this amendment, and then enough states ratify it, and it joins the Constitution. But so there's a paradoxical relation. I think what I picked for my liberty document with respect to slavery, in addition to the Gettysburg Address, and also the Declaration, as Lincoln, makes the point. Mm-hmm. But I picked the Constitution of the New York Manumission Society, and you can tell I've got a lot of New York things. Okay, I plead guilty. I'm a New Yorker, but I wanted to make the point that slavery was not just a Southern thing. There were a lot of slaves in northern colonies and states. There were more slaves in New York City than any other American city except Charleston in the late 18th century. And after the Revolution, there was a kind of fortuitous alliance of Quakers who had decided as a religion to forbid the ownership of slaves, but also the elite of New York. The elite signed on to this. There was the governor of New York, George Clinton, the mayor of New York City, James Duane. There was John Jay, revolutionary diplomat, patriot, spy master. And then there's this R.E.V. Alexander Hamilton, who was on Washington's staff, and he's married to Schuyler, and he's coming up in the world. So it was this alliance of these Quakers and then these members of the state's elite who decided we can't have this anymore. And they go gradually. They set up schools for free blacks, because one of their arguments is that if free blacks are ignorant, they are more likely to be spirited away by slave catchers. I mean, people came to look for runaway slaves, and if they couldn't find runaway slaves, they'd grab black freemen. I mean, there was a movie recently, like 12 Years a Slave, which was about this, and this happened. One of the stimuluses for the New York Manumission Society was they had foiled an effort to get some black freemen on a ship and sail them off to the Bay of Honduras. And this was kind of a big scandal, and that was the immediate stimulus. They also lobbied for laws such as no slaves may be imported into New York, and no slaves may be taken out of New York. So they didn't want slave traffic in and out of the state. They lobbied for a law that all the slaves of loyalists who were confiscated by the New York state government should be liberated. And they were liberated. And then in 1799, this is 14 years after they get going, John Jay, who's the first president of the society, is governor of New York, and he signs the law that will end it by 1827. And he's still alive when that happens, so he can see the fulfillment of his handiwork. And Jay he helped write New York's Constitution during the middle of the Revolution, and he tried to put anti-slavery language into the state constitution. He failed. And then 3 years later, he's writing a letter to someone. He says, until we do this, until America does this, our prayers for liberty will be impious. And he says, I know that's a hard saying, but it's a true one. So Jay really cared about this. And I think it's also important to signal someone as prominent as that in the founding generation, saying it both as rhetoric and then also taking actual steps to make it happen.
That story and that facet of our history raises the question of the relationship between liberty and equality in the American story. There's a way of telling the American story where equality is the primary principle. Even the story of the Declaration, maybe even the story of the Gettysburg Address. Gettysburg Address, today is its anniversary, by the way, November 19th, 1863, in a way establishes the notion that all men are created equal at the center of the American story. How is equality related to liberty?
Well, because although liberty, as I'm talking about it, is personal, when a country frees itself from an imperial power, that's a form of liberty, but that's collective. But I'm talking about personal liberty, but it also has to be plural. You can't be the only free person in a country. I mean, it would be like a science fiction, a Philip Dick novel or something. There's some authoritarian state and there's one free man in it for some odd reason. But that doesn't work. I mean, he's like living the life of a spy, that person would be, or some alien or something. It's personal, but as the men of Flushing pointed out, it also has to apply to everybody. Mine is yours. Ours is theirs. And that is how it has to work. And that I think was Lincoln's great insight. And Jefferson must have had it too, but Lincoln really, hammers at this over years. And I think our experience has borne this out.
Does that point in a populist direction? I was struck the Cross of Gold speech is in this list. How is the Cross of Gold speech about liberty?
It's in there for one sentence in the paragraph. Well, this is the paragraph that Bryan himself said was the best paragraph in it. And it's not the one that gives it its name. It's not the conclusion, which just blew the roof off the Chicago Democratic Convention in 1896. And if you're political junkies, it's just a fun story to see how Bryan maneuvered to give this speech. It was a debate on the gold, on the silver plank of the platform. So there were 3 pro-gold speakers, 2 silver ones. Silver would start and finish. They said, all right, Bryan will be one, and Senator Ben Tillman of South Carolina will be the other one. Tillman was a murderer. He'd gotten his start in politics murdering black Republicans. He was a senator from South Carolina. And so Bryan talks to Tillman, and Tillman wants to close, but he says, I want to talk for 50 minutes. And Bryan tells him, well, you can't close a debate and talk for 50 minutes. So Tillman says, all right, I'll go first. Bryan gets to conclude. And, and he's been working on themes and passages of this for years, and he gives the performance of his life. And he ends by, saying, you shall not press down on the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind on the cross of gold, which gives the speech its name. But he thought there was a better paragraph in it, which he had written for the first time the night before. And it begins with this sentence. He's rebutting an argument that the pro-gold forces were making, that a silver standard would derange American business. And American businessmen were opposed to it for that reason. And Bryan says, you have too narrow a definition of businessman. He says, the man who works for wages is as much a businessman as the man who pays his wages. And when I read that sentence, I thought, that is very important. And then the paragraph goes on. He has examples. The farmer is as important as the man who bets on grain in the wheat pit at Chicago, and he's got a series of parallelisms. But that first sentence, and that is just a reminder to us that in the economic realm also, all players are created equal. Now, that doesn't mean they end up with the same amount of money at the end of the day, or that they begin with the same amount. But you should never think that just because this guy has $1 billion, he's special. Mm-hmm. Beyond the fact that he's very talented at whatever he did to make the money. You have to give him that. But should he therefore be president? Should we have a pseudo-billionaire as president, or even a real billionaire as president, just because there were billionaires? Probably not. I mean, you have to see what else they think. But that's not enough. So I wanted to put Bryan in there for that. I'm not pro-silver. McKinley got the better of that argument. I quote one of the things McKinley says in the campaign, which I think is very on point. But that's an ancillary issue, even though that was the big thing in the foreground. What Bryan said about the man earning wages being a businessman just like the employer is what I wanted to stress.
I want to open things up to questions from the room, but I have to ask one more question, which is really about where things stand now on this question of liberty. The last of these documents in the book is from 35 years ago. What's happened since on the question of liberty? Has no one said anything worth thinking about? Are we in trouble?
I think we might be. I mean, just reading the newspapers or online or whatever, in all the chatter, there's not much of it on this theme. But I've been asked, what would a 14th document after 1987 be? And I'm saying, I don't want to get into anything that would unnecessarily put off any reader of this book, because I think people on the right should read these stories. I think people on the left, people on no side, should read these stories, because these stories affect all of us. They're for all of us. These were, many of them, very intelligent men and women, many of them very brave. Many of them were putting their own liberty on the line. I mean, the people who stood up to Peter Stuyvesant, he threw them in jail. And these stories are important, and they should be inspiring. It should be inspiring to us.
Let's take some questions. The only rule really is that you tell us who you are and try to frame your question as an actual question. We'll start over here. Let's just wait for a microphone, if that's all right.
I went from the arsenal of democracy to Reagan's speech, and I know you said there was a B team, but you went right by JFK and Dr. King, and I just wonder, what was your thinking there? Did they say anything worthwhile about liberty?
Well, sure they did. I have a a little discussion of the B team idea in the epilogue, and my motto is Clinton Rossiter's great book on the Constitutional Convention, which I think is called the Grand Convention or the Great Convention. It's like a 50-year-old book. Wonderful book. But he says, could there have been 55 other Americans who could have done the Constitution as well? It's his thought experiment. And he even restricts himself to picking the same number from each state. So New Hampshire sent 2, he's got to find 2 from New Hampshire. Pennsylvania sent 8, he's got to find 8 from Pennsylvania, and so on. And he comes up with another 55. With the caveat, he says, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, of course, were sui generis and irreplaceable. So any B-team list would have to have the Declaration in it, the Gettysburg Address, if it was going to be the most important 13. But yes, you could have these lists, and King's speech on the Washington Mall, and I refer to that in the book because he's using the same technique that the Seneca Falls Declaration used, to say, well, we want our deficiency repaired, but here's the reason for it. We're echoing the language of the Declaration. And King, of course, the promissory note passage from that speech. So yeah, there are other things you might find both before and after 1987. There was one over here?
Yeah.
It's such a small room, we could probably all speak up, but.
Yeah, fair enough.
My name's Luke Phillips. I work with a bipartisan civic org called Better Angels. So the subtitle is A History of America's Exceptional Idea. And I was wondering if there's an implication when you call liberty America's exceptional idea, if it's also America's quintessential and indispensable idea as well. Like, to the degree that there are multiple American ideals, liberty plus equality and justice and union and all those, should liberty take a precedence over those other ideals as well? And is there to some degree that, like, if it's possible to be un-American, is being against liberty being un-American in a sense at all?
Yes. Yes, this is the essential idea. I'll go further. We have done the most work on it. I looked at the 2 countries we've probably rubbed up against most in our history, are Britain and France. And they certainly have liberty as a thread in the histories of both. We've obviously taken a lot from Britain's experience of it, but I think it plays a lesser role there. Even Canada. I did a big piece on Canadian politics years ago for Vanity Fair. Graydon Carter told me he knew something interesting was happening. He said, go everywhere in Canada. And I wrote what I thought was a nice piece, and then he didn't run it, I think for the same reason he asked me to do it, which is that he's Canadian. So he's Canadian, so he knew something interesting was happening, but then he thought, oh, geez, if I run this, people will say I only did it because I'm Canadian. So he backed off. But, and I love Canada. Canada's a great place. Love Canadians, what better neighbors, but they don't have a First Amendment. They don't. Now, Canadians are nice people, so they don't crack down a lot, but they can really crack down if they want to, and there have been instances where they have. Canadians are neurotics, we're psychotics, but they don't have a First Amendment.
Let's take a question right up here in front.
Hi, Bruce. Oh, this is working. Bruce Guthrie. I've always interpreted the Monroe Doctrine not as a liberty document, but basically, we don't want you to interfere in those areas because we want to control them. Why do you consider the Monroe Doctrine to be a liberty? I mean, it's our liberty to screw around with those countries, but I don't see it as their liberty to be free.
Well, we certainly weren't doing anything to those countries in 1823. I mean, not one thing. Not even helping them in their liberation struggles. But we were telling Europe, if you're thinking of sending Bourbon princes over here, this will be interpreted as a hostile act. And Monroe said political systems. So he's not just talking about recolonization. He's also talking about don't send, you know, your second order royal family members over here to set themselves up as sovereigns, which does happen during the Civil War, by the way. Napoleon III sends a Habsburg prince and makes him the king or the emperor of Mexico. And he's doing it because we're distracted. And then as soon as the war ends, he pulls his troops out, and then the poor man is shot by the Mexicans. But so it was a real threat. It wasn't a nonsense threat. And we were just saying, no more kings in this hemisphere. We will consider that hostile. Now, when I go into the history here, and one reason Monroe says this is he knows that Britain is also opposed to this, and Britain has the greatest navy in the world. So since Britain also doesn't want Latin America recolonized for reasons of trade, you know, because Spain had a mercantile empire, no one could trade there except Spain, and both America and Britain want to do that. You know, Britain, no armada of European princes is going to cross the Atlantic so long as the British Navy rules it, which it does. So Monroe has some confidence that this statement of his has some backing behind it. But it is not just an anti-colonialist or, as you were suggesting, neo-colonialist statement. It's a statement of political separation. He's saying your systems are not going to be reinstituted here.
Take a question in the back.
Hi, my name is Brian Penn, and I want to give you a chance to rant. So we've already talked about slavery a little bit, but what is your opinion of the New York Times 1619 project that states or posits that America was conceived in slavery and dedicated to slavery and not to liberty?
Well, you know, Lincoln did say that the Civil War was payback for 250 years of unrequited toil. You know, and the math there is 1615, which isn't quite right. The White Lion comes in, I believe it's August. The first meeting of the General Assembly was several weeks before. So self-rule actually got its start before the 20 and odd Negroes were purchased off the White Lion in 1619. So there's that, you know, that sort of chronological brief head start. But yes, sure, it's woven through our history, but as I said, a lot of men were killed to end slavery, and it was ended. So that's what I would say to that. I mean, my 1619 project is the General Assembly at Jamestown, because that's the one that has lasted longest and been the most fruitful.
Take a question here.
My name is Joe Freeman. I actually have two questions, one New York and one slavery in the South. Can I ask them both, or shall I wait between them?
Let's ask one and see what happens.
Okay, the New York question is the easy question, since you're a New Yorker. There are an awful lot of things in New York named Stuyvesant. Is the name for that Stuyvesant?
Yeah, he's the one.
That was easy.
That was the easy, okay. I was just struck by it. That's the easy one. You want to ask the New York question or wait?
Let's take one last question.
Oh, you mean I don't get to ask my favorite question?
You can ask Rick afterward if you like. Right over here is fine.
Good evening. My name is David Ansara. I'm from the South African Institute of Race Relations. To what extent, and you mentioned John Locke, to what extent do you think that the idea of liberty in the United States gained credence because of the extensive property-owning classes that emerged here, as opposed to the very small property-owning class in the United Kingdom?
You mean the fact that there were more owners of property, numerically more?
And what is that? Is there a relationship there between property ownership and this idea of liberty that people have their own piece of the earth that endows them with certain rights and a kind of a level of freedom and independence.
Oh yeah, I think there definitely is. One of the things that Jamestown did, even before the first meeting of the General Assembly, was that they gave you 50. How many acres was it? It was some number of acres if you came over to settle. You would get those. And if you brought other people with you, you'd get bonus acres. Now, this encouraged indentured servants, which is that like slavery? Well, it sort of is. I mean, it's not like slavery because indentured contracts end. They do have a time limit on it. But there was this incentive if you brought people over. They didn't have to be indentured servants. They could be, relatives of yours or friends. You would get a property bonus. So yes, and then there was also, as many people have pointed out, for the longest time, you could just walk west, try and find some new property, and that's what plenty of people did. I mean, over the mountains and off, and they died of diseases and they died in wars with Indians and all the rest of it, but people kept doing it. And that's because that was the incentive, that was the reward.
Well, thanks very much. You can buy this great book out in the hallway, and Rick will be here for a little while to sign copies. And join me in thanking Richard Brookhiser. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.